Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everybody, and good evening for those joining us on the other side of the Pacific. Thank you very much for logging in today for the second part of our two-part conference on the future of the U.S. Vietnam Partnership. So for those who were able to join us 2 days ago, we focused mainly on the economic and trade aspects of the partnership. Today, the focus will be more on politics and security. Although I'd encourage you, if you have questions on any range of issues, please feel free to ask them today. We'll get both panels up on YouTube as soon as we can, and would encourage everybody to share them as widely as you like. And I should note up at the top that everything that's said today is going to be on the record. The conference is being made possible by generous support from Samsung, which we always appreciate. What we're going to do is start with a keynote address today by Edgard Kagan, who's Senior Director for East Asia and Oceania on the National Security Council. Edgard will give us a few minutes remarks, and then we'll move into a Q&A. And so we're going to use the Q&A function on Zoom for those who would like to ask a question, either to Edgard in this first session or on our panel later, which will start at 9:30. Go ahead and type it into the Q&A function, and please do identify yourselves so everybody knows who they're addressing. And with that, I think I will step out of the way and turn the floor over to Edgard.
Thank you very, very much, Greg. And I want to thank you, Andreka, Murray, and the team at CSIS, and to say that, I'm very honored to be here, in no small part because the work that you and your colleagues have done in recent years has been truly impressive and something that has really shaped my thinking and my understanding of Southeast Asia writ large, and it's something I appreciate even more now that I'm in this role. First of all of you know the U.S. Vietnam relationship better than I do. I'm a relative novice at this. I observed it when I was the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kuala Lumpur from 2014 to 2017, and it's obviously been a very important part of the discussions that we've had with our Indian friends in the time that I've been in New Delhi. But at the same time, I come to this with a great deal of humility because so much extraordinary work has been done by so many people in both countries over the last 30 years. I think a couple of things. I mean, one, I think all of you have heard the administration's views on the centrality and importance of the Indo-Pacific, the focus on the Indo-Pacific, and the recognition that when the history of the 21st century is written, much of it is going to be about what happens in the Indo-Pacific. And so we have been very focused on trying to make sure that we carry out aggressive and very ambitious set of initiatives to try and bring some of the work that has already been done, and there's been some very good work that's been done in the last decade and more, to try and move it forward. And I think that most of you will have seen that we have focused on the Quad and having both a Quad ministerial and then a summit level Quad at which we tried to address genuine issues of great consequence in the region, including the vaccine initiative to produce 1 billion doses of vaccine, additional doses of vaccine through expanding manufacturing capability that would be done through the end of 2022. We've also tried to focus on expanding our existing relationships and strengthening them. And you've seen the decision to have the first in-person visit to the White House by Prime Minister Suga. And then the second one has been announced, and we'll be announcing the date very shortly. But we've announced it will be in the second half of May by ROK President Moon Jae-in. We've also tried to engage in Southeast Asia. We recognize the importance of the region and the importance of ASEAN centrality. And I think that as we do that, the U.S. Vietnam relationship, I think, takes on even more importance for reasons that are obvious in terms of the geography, but also, I think, the very special nature of the relationship. It's been 25 years of diplomatic relations, and there was some work that was done before that to establish diplomatic relations. We've seen just extraordinary progress in bilateral relationship and the building of a relationship that has a remarkable level of understanding and candor, and a great expansion of the things that we do together. And I think that there's also a truly strategic dimension to the relationship that is understandable given the history of both countries and the history of the relationship. I think we see Vietnam as a key leader in the region. And I think that there's no question that Vietnam carries extraordinary respect in the region, and that Vietnam's influence is significant because of the fact that Southeast Asian countries and other major players outside have such high regard for Vietnam. I think what we have seen is the importance of engagement, and the importance of engagement, not just at high levels of government, but also the building of much stronger people-to-people ties. I think that, if you look across the spectrum, what is interesting about the U.S.-Vietnam relationship is how much of it really has been built by engagement between the peoples, building on the very complex legacy of the war, but also on the fact that there has been a real effort, I would argue, by both countries to look for ways to work together. So I think our view is this offers tremendous potential, and that it's very much a challenge, but a responsibility, but also an opportunity for us to take the relationship to the next level. I think, naturally, a big chunk of the relationship is built on security. There's I think a shared understanding on security issues, even if there's not complete alignment. But I think it's something that we've been able to speak very frankly to each other about. And we really do appreciate Vietnam's commitment and willingness to stand up for international maritime law and its concerns about resource coercion. And we feel like we have good understanding, but also potential to make them much stronger. We're looking at many ways to enhance this cooperation, but I think that one of them that we're particularly focused on right now is strengthening Coast Guard to Coast Guard ties. Because of the importance of dealing with transnational crime and illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. Now, I want to be very clear. I think there are some people who really do view that this is a relationship that is based on security only, and that it's really based about shared concerns about the South China Sea, and Vietnam's historic concerns about how to manage a very complex and very challenging neighborhood. And while there's no question that has been part of the relationship, I think that it really underplays the degree to which the relationship as it stands today has been built on a variety of other issues, in particular extraordinary economic cooperation. There's no question that U.S. investment in Vietnam is very significant. I think in many ways, Vietnam is one of the great beneficiaries of both the CPTPP as well as the general sense that countries are looking for places to invest and build capacity other than China. And, speaking from the perspective of having been in Malaysia and then in India, there's no question in both those countries, people look to a great deal of envy at how much of new investment of companies that were trying to balance out their portfolios and make sure that they weren't overly dependent on one country or one market, how much that new investment was going into Vietnam. And I think that reflects both sustained effort by the government of Vietnam and an appreciation for what Vietnam brings by American companies, as well as other multinational companies. I think we look forward to expanding the existing Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, or TIFA, as an umbrella for further trade and investment talks. And I think that we realize that there's some frictions in the bilateral economic relationship. I think we just have to be upfront about that. One of the strengths of where we are in our relationship with Vietnam is that we have much better capacity and ability to deal with friction. We're able to speak candidly with each other. That doesn't mean we agree on everything, obviously, and there are very few countries with which we do, in fact. But I think that our ability to have these conversations, to be direct, and to try and build understanding of each other's positions reflects growth in the relationship that I think would have been much more difficult in, at the beginning, the sort of last 25 years. We are committed to finding more ways to work with Vietnam. One of them is through the U.S. Mekong Partnership, and there are other mechanisms such as the Japan-U.S. Mekong Power Partnership. We're looking for ways to expand our cooperation on clean energy, green infrastructure, and East-West connectivity, all of which are things that we believe offer us a lot of opportunity to work closely with Vietnam on issues that are of interest to Vietnam. I think in that space, there's no question that climate change offers, in our view, a real opportunity. We were very pleased that Vietnam accepted the invitation to join in last week's climate summit. And I think that what we see is Vietnam recognizes that this is not just important for Vietnam, not just important for the region, for the world, but it also offers a potential platform to further expand cooperation with key partners, including, in our view, the United States. I think that we do want to make sure that as we think about climate, that we're looking more broadly at environmental issues, which are obviously linked back to the Mekong River and the Mekong Delta and the lower Mekong Valley. I think all of these things are areas where we have tremendous opportunities to support Vietnam and support other Mekong countries as they deal with a very, very challenging set of issues and try and reconcile very, very different priorities and competing interests. At the same time, we think this is something that the international community and partners such as the United States, but also Australia, Japan, Korea, all have the potential to also be part of this and to try and help the region deal with things that are going to be very critical for the future of, I would argue, certainly for Vietnam, but I think Cambodia and Laos are very affected by this. And we've been positively impressed by the openness to cooperate on this. The last is that, obviously human rights remains a challenge in the relationship. I think that we've reached a point where we can be pretty upfront about it. There's no hiding it. At the same time, we also recognize that we need to find ways to make progress, not just point fingers. And I think that we are looking at a variety of tools to do that. And I think that obviously the most important one is to have candid conversations to make clear the importance that this issue has in terms of really strengthening the people-to-people ties between our countries and opening up the aperture so that we can do more. So I'll close by saying that I'm tremendously optimistic. I think that this is a relationship that is very different, frankly, from, in my view, many of our other relationships, certainly the ones I've worked on. It is one where we have a lot of common interests. We have some diverging views as well. And I think that our view is that Vietnam is a vital partner. We want to expand the partnership. That is going to take work by both sides. But at the same time, we don't see it as being possible to build the kind of relationship we would with the broader Indo-Pacific without having a strong focus on Southeast Asia. And to be effective in Southeast Asia, certainly in our view, you need to have an effective, productive relationship with Vietnam. So I want to just stress, there are many challenges, and we're aware of those. I'm sure that there's going to be areas of friction. There's going to be areas of disagreement, but we believe that we've built a strong enough relationship, in no small part through having some outstanding ambassadors from in each capital who have really been critical to building out the relationship. And I want to just give a tip of the hat to some of my friends and colleagues who've served in Vietnam and, in my view, done an outstanding job in building the relationship, and to some truly extraordinary Vietnamese representatives who have done a really, really good job at both explain Vietnam to Americans, but I think also helping guide Vietnam as it engages effectively with the United States. So we want to expand that. We think there's tremendous potential. It's very much in the interest of the United States. And, we believe perhaps, classic American self-centeredness, that we believe it's in Vietnam's interest as well. And, we have the opportunity, and it's up to us to seize it and try and make real progress in the coming years. So with that, let me close and take some questions.
Thank you, Edgard. Let's open the Q&A section. So again, if you'd like to ask a question, please do click the Q&A button on Zoom, type it there, and identify yourself, and I will read it out to Edgard. In the meantime, let me start off the conversation, if you don't mind, with a question about your previous posting in India. And you mentioned that Vietnam came up. India has a quite close relationship with Vietnam, including a security relationship that it really doesn't have anywhere else in the region. And Vietnam has evinced more support for the idea of the Quad in recent polling and anecdotally than really any other state in Southeast Asia. What do you think Vietnam's role is in operating kind of with the Quad, supporting Quad involvement in Southeast Asia, and where do the U.S. and India plug in here with the Vietnam relationship?
Thanks, Greg. I think those are great questions, and questions that we ask ourselves, and we ask certainly when I was in New Delhi, we asked the Indians. I think that India sees Vietnam as a very, very important partner, in part because I think that they see perhaps more opportunities and more open doors because of their shared history together, and also because of similar perspectives on security, on maritime issues, on defense. I think that the Indians very much see Vietnam as a country that has an ability and a willingness to act independently to defend its interests, that is not doctrinaire in terms of how it looks at the world, and very pragmatic, and at the same time willing to be tough when it's necessary to defend its sovereignty and defend its interests. That's something that I think the Indians connect with. I think that the Indians also, at least in my experience, India, saw an opportunity in Vietnam exactly because Vietnam was going through significant growth. There's opportunities for Indian companies, or at least they believed. And I would say that in recent years, the one fly in the ointment has been more of a sense of competition with Vietnam in terms of being a destination for investment, and particularly for multinational companies that are moving or trying to rebalance their portfolios by expanding capacity outside of China. There's no question that, at least when I served as Consul General in Mumbai, authorities there really did feel that when they were looking at who they were competing with to attract investment, they were in many ways, in many specific cases, competing with Vietnam, and very honestly, Vietnam won a fair number of times. So I think there's a great deal of respect for what Vietnam has managed to do with its economy, and also in terms of making itself attractive for foreign investment, and a great deal of respect for how Vietnam thinks of its interests and its ability to act in defense of those interests.
We have a shy audience this morning, so I'm going to ask you another one while they get their courage up. So one of the other things that became clear in some polling that CSIS did last year and some other polling from ISEAS is that Vietnam has the highest level of anxiety about China in Southeast Asia. It was happy to see the seemingly tougher stance that the U.S. was taking on China, and it evinced the highest level of, let's say, skepticism about the incoming Biden administration. We didn't see, levels of disapproval, but we certainly saw a higher degree of skepticism than we saw in other parts of Southeast Asia. How do you think the administration's done in the first 100 days in assuaging those concerns in Hanoi?
Look, I mean, I'm obviously tremendously biased, so I'm not sure that I'm the most, objective observer here. But I would say that I think we've done fairly well. I mean, I don't want to be too optimistic about it, but I think that in terms of the initial concerns that were in many ways driven by concerns about the approach to China, I think that we've done fairly well. I think that also in terms of initial statements and engagements on issues surrounding the South China Sea, I think that we've, assuaged some of the concerns. I think that where we have probably, still some ground to go is that, and this is driven in no small part by COVID, is that we just need to get back to some level of regular order in terms of being able to engage through visits and meetings. And I think that that's something that is true everywhere. But I think that it is particularly true in Southeast Asia, where there is a sense that in order to show that we're really committed to the region, we need to show up, and that's at every level. And obviously, it's a lot harder to address that if there are really strict restrictions that make it very difficult to show up. So I think that we still have some ground to cover there. I think that there's also an interest in seeing how we manage key relationships in the region, because I do think that what Vietnam looks at is not just the U.S. Vietnam bilateral relationship, which is obviously very important to them and to us, but they, I think, are extremely aware of the importance of our broader set of relationships in the region. So, from their standpoint, at least it has been expressed to me, they see real benefit to the engagements we've done in Northeast Asia with Japan and with Korea. They see real benefit to the strengthening of our web and network of ties in the region. I think you're absolutely right that Vietnam has been much more comfortable publicly with the Quad than many other countries. I think that that has been helped by the focus in Quad documents. You may have noticed that we did a joint statement out of the summit, which was the first time there had been a Quad joint statement that did focus and emphasize ASEAN centrality. So I think that my view is that we're doing relatively well, certainly much better than I think some people in a number of countries, including Vietnam, had feared. But I think that we still have not completely sealed the deal in terms of showing the kind of commitment to the region that people want. I think that we're working on that, and to some degree, it's I would say in Southeast Asia, is probably more linked than any other region with which I deal to travel and to the ability to have in-person engagements. And as we start being able to do more of that, hopefully we will be able to further reinforce the commitment we have to a much stronger relationship with the Indo-Pacific writ large and with Southeast Asia and with Vietnam in particular.
Thanks, Edgard. All right, now we have a Q&A that's overflowing, so I spoke too soon. Let me give the first question to Zach Abuza at the National War College. Sorry. Zach asked whether or not the administration will continue to give Vietnam a waiver for CAATSA sanctions.
First of all, just to be very clear, I don't believe that a waiver has been granted before. And that some of that is linked specifically to how CAATSA is written and what is covered. I think that the broader question is really one of how do we view Vietnam's relationship on defense procurement with Russia. And obviously we have concerns about it. At the same time, we're very realistic that, given the degree to which its military equipment is dominated by items of Russian origin, this is not something that's going to change quickly, and that there are a lot of factors that go into it. So I think that we will watch closely. I think obviously, we do recognize that there are real issues with further dependence on Russia, but that realistically, there's the ability to change that quickly is going to be limited. So I think our hope is that we're able to engage seriously with Vietnam. I think that the way to do this is, frankly, not to do this in public, to do this in private, and to have very direct conversations. But I also think that we fully appreciate the importance of Vietnam's ability to be able to defend itself, and the importance that plays in terms of the broader region.
Thanks. Let me give the next question to Ha Chao Vu, who said, given China's growing ambition in the South China Sea and the Mekong, how would you suggest that Vietnam, the United States, deepen security cooperation and defense ties?
Look, I think that we have, in many ways, we've blazed a pretty good path on this. And so it's a question of further expanding what we have done, looking for more ways to do things together, to have very practical conversations. I think that it's important to recognize that we have very similar interests and understandings in some of these areas. There are others where we have different views. We are looking to have a partnership, and that requires having candid conversations, looking for areas to cooperate. I think recognizing that there are political sensitivities, and we need to be realistic about that, but that we should be able to find ways to work around those to strengthen the bone and sinew of the relationship and expand our capacity to do things together, and to react as necessary. I think that the Coast Guard partnership relationship is one that offers a great deal of potential. I think that looking for ways to have further discussions, to look for ways to support capabilities, all those are very important and offer, I think, a mechanism where we have seen progress and we have potential to make much more.
Thanks. Let's go to Mark Mannion next. So Mark asked a question that Ted Osius also received 2 days ago, or a related question. will the Biden administration continue the Trump administration's policy of deporting to Vietnam ethnic Vietnamese who have resided in the United States for most of their lives and been convicted of crimes?
Look, that's a really good question. And I think that, the honest answer is that this is something that, there are legal requirements on the U.S. side that we obviously have to abide by. I think that we also recognize that there's some, human challenges, and there's some real challenges in terms of the mechanics and from Vietnam's perspective, the legal aspects of this. So that's going to be something that's going to be a work in progress. I think that we're going to try and find ways to hopefully manage as effectively as possible. But I think that, and it's also something that we'll be talking more to our colleagues at DHS as we get more people confirmed there and their leadership is fleshed out. I think this is a challenge in the region, and it's a somewhat unique challenge because of the history of the way in which so many people, not just from Vietnam, but from Laos and Cambodia, came to the United States. And at the same time, there are very clear legal requirements under U.S. law that very much restrict the ability to show great flexibility. So how we juggle that will be a challenge. I think that the key is going to be as direct as possible. So try and be as candid and as flexible as possible in terms of how we do it, but recognize that there are areas in which our hands are tied, and we really do need to comply with U.S. law.
Thanks, Edgard. Next one goes to Scott Thompson, who wants to talk about climate change. He said, is it fair to say that the approach would suggest that any future U.S. carbon border adjustment system would be designed to incentivize Vietnam and others to implement effective climate approaches over time, rather than suggesting more punitive tariffs or import taxes up front?
Look, I think that across the board, we believe very strongly that this is something that is an existential threat to the human race, and that we need to get people to buy into the need to address it. That coercive approaches are and this is a personal view, but I think that it's aligned with everything I've seen coming out of the administration. They rarely work. This is something that what we need to do is make sure that we have as much of an understanding around the world as possible, and that people are incentivized in a positive way rather than through more coercive tactics. I think that what we've seen is that Vietnam is showing great interest, and I think there is an understanding of the impact of climate change. And I think there's also a growing understanding that what was long viewed as that there was a trade-off between growth and dealing with climate or dealing with environment is not true. That yes, you end up with different models for growth, but that there are real opportunities, real economic opportunities from trying to address climate change. And so this is something that's true for developed countries. I think it's also, there's increasing recognition of this in developing countries. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Interests are going to diverge. Obviously, everybody thinks that, climate change is something that should really be addressed by somebody else more than by them. And so I don't want to sound Pollyannish and think that this is going to be easy, but I do think that there is a real opportunity as countries recognize not just the dangers, the existential dangers from climate change, but also the economic opportunities that come from trying to change the model for growth.
Thanks, Edgard. This may be our last question. Thomas Barnett is giving everybody a lesson on how to gear your question toward the moderator as much as the panelists. He asks,
You're the one.
He asks, what is the administration's plan for seeking ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty and strengthening alignment with Vietnam on legal regimes in the South China Sea?
Look, the short answer is I don't know what the plan is in terms of ratification. I can tell you that the U.S. position on this has been clear for many years, which is that we comply with the Law of the Sea. And I mean, very frankly, our view is that there are countries that have ratified that don't comply, and that our compliance and our abiding by it is actually quite significant. So we will definitely continue doing that. We fully appreciate its importance and the value that it brings, and the need to have something like it. I think that I don't need to tell people here the challenges of getting a ratification of a treaty, and that has been true for a long time. But it is something where we will continue to abide by the convention, and we will continue to comply with it, and we will continue to see it as a very, very critical international tool for dealing with very challenging and complex issues.
Thanks. We are right at 9:30, and so I promised to let you go, and I'll do that. We have 10 more questions in the Q&A. I hope everybody sticks around for the panel, and I'll try to work some of these in and force the panelists to give some answers as Edgard gets out of here. So first, please join me in thanking Edgard with a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you to everyone, and it is always a pleasure, and look forward to doing more of these. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Now let's move right into our panel discussion. So we've got a great set of speakers. We're going to start by hearing from my colleague Murray Hebert, who's a senior associate at CSIS and had the misfortune of helping to hire me in the first place about a decade ago. He's also the director of research at Bauer Group Asia. Then we'll move to Bictron, who is pursuing her PhD at Antwerp University and is a fellow with Verve Research. And we'll close with Nguyen Tuan Viet, who's the Dean of the Department of International Politics and Diplomacy at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Murray, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Greg. So Greg suggested that seeing the conference had the one beginning on Tuesday had focused a lot on the current economic situation, and today was going to focus a lot on the current political and security cooperation, that maybe I should, as the old guy or something, should deal a little bit with the history and where relations have come from. And it really, like Edgar said, it is amazing how far relations have come since 1975. I was living in neighboring Laos in 1976 when I was invited to visit Hanoi for the first time. I'd spent time in the South during the war, but never been to the North. So I have to say, for people that have been there recently, I'll just give a minute and a half of color. There were no cars on the streets except for a few ladas that were for the diplomatic community, almost no motorbikes, only bicycles. And you heard this quiet whirling of bicycles. It still was impossible to cross the street, probably even as hard as it is today. There were no shops, no restaurants along the streets. You only had the giant department store with nothing that anybody wanted to buy. And then on the street, you had some women selling single cigarettes. And then the traffic on the Lumbian Bridge, which at that point was the only bridge across the river into the Red River Delta, you had to travel on opposite sides of the bridge because the trucks coming in with all the produce were tilting and then leaving empty, were tilting the bridge. So you would have to go on opposite sides. And when you had a flight sort of like early in the morning, you'd have to leave your hotel at 3:30 in the morning to get across the bridge to catch a morning flight. And I could go on, but it is so amazing to think back of these old images of Vietnam and realizing where we have come today. I'll talk about a couple of different periods very briefly in our relationship. Obviously, we have to begin with what happened after 1975. Almost immediately, Vietnam, Hanoi offered normalization, but it called on reparations of $3.3 billion, which Nixon had allegedly promised. And the climate in Washington was absolutely, one of anger and humiliation at having lost the war, and there was no interest in normalization. And very quickly, President Ford and Secretary of State Kissinger said that any moves toward normalization depended on accounting for the missing Americans. Then in 1978, Vietnam dropped the conditions for reparations and offered normalization, but this was put on hold by the US because Vietnam moved to sign a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union, and then in December invaded Cambodia and ousted the Khmer Rouge, and then soon China invaded northern Vietnam. The U.S. at that time was mostly preoccupied with refugees fleeing Vietnam and normalizing relations with China. And gradually, another condition that entered relations for normalization was Vietnam's withdrawal from Cambodia. And then a second period I'll talk about is what happened in the 80s. In the years immediately after the war ended, the Communist Party introduced quite hardline and doctrinaire socialist policies, including in the South. So farmers were put into collectives, cooperatives, banks, factories, et cetera, were nationalized. In the midst of international sanctions and isolation, Vietnam's economy went into a tailspin, and Vietnam had to import rice, which is a little shocking, seeing that they're now the world's first, second, or third largest exporter of rice, depending on the year. But they realized they had to do something. And with the hostilities from the international community, hostilities from China, deteriorating, declining Soviet Union, Vietnam had the really landmark Fifth Party Congress, which introduced economic reforms, commonly known as Doi Moi, which began the moves toward free market economic principles, abandoned cooperatives, and invited investment. And we didn't know it at the time, but at that party Congress, there were also steps to begin figuring out how to withdraw troops from Cambodia and begin to expand relations with the US. And then the next year, General Vesey was sent as a presidential envoy to start to negotiate how to get more progress on the missing Americans. And in exchange, the US offered humanitarian aid. And then moving quickly to a third period, the 1990s, when President George H.W. Bush and his Assistant Secretary Richard Solomon came up with a roadmap to normalization. They said Vietnam needed to withdraw from Cambodia, account for the missing, negotiate a ceasefire in Cambodia, and work on supporting UN elections in Cambodia. And in exchange for that, the US would move to lift the embargo and ease restrictions against World Bank loans. There have been many, as Edgar referred to, many, he didn't call them this, but there's been many godfathers and godmothers that really were I guess I'm mixing metaphors, but were midwives in getting the relations to improve. In Vietnam, then Foreign Minister Nguyen Ca Thach, who is the father of Pham Binh Minh, until recently Foreign Minister, and his deputy Foreign Minister Lê Mai. Some of these people were just huge players in seeing the relationship improve. But Senators McCain and Senator Kerry, both veterans of the war, McCain also a prisoner of war, began to work on they realized that in the US, there was a big block against normalization unless there was an accounting. So they made a yeoman's effort, the two senators, constant shuttle diplomacy between Hanoi and Washington, and gradually they got the Vietnamese to step up cooperation. And this created the goodwill, trust, confidence, et cetera, that President Clinton could use to lift the embargo in February 1994, and then normalize diplomatic relations in 1995. And the various types of cooperation, which really are pretty phenomenal. Ambassador Hakim Ngap referred to this on Tuesday. Edgar again referred to it today. All these different levels of cooperation and dealing with dealing with each other And, there were animosities on both sides. The Vietnamese military, certainly, they had a lot of respect for Americans, but they really didn't trust them entirely. But all this cooperation led eventually to on MIAs in particular, led ultimately to cooperation on unexploded ordnance, cleaning up Agent Orange in around some airports, Da Nang and Bien Hoa. And now led to the military security cooperation that we're going to talk about in a minute to reach the levels that it's now reached. And Edgar also referred to the differences on human rights, but there's a dialogue set up to discuss this. The U.S. and Vietnam signed a bilateral trade agreement, which was a huge boost for Vietnam's understanding on how to begin functioning in the international economy. Vietnam and the U.S. joined the TPP, and Vietnam now is one of the largest investors, target for American investors, but many others, as Edgar alluded to. Party chief Nguyen Phu Trong has visited Washington. The White House, you would never have thought that back in the 70s, I can tell you. And the U.S. lifted the ban on military sales and provided Coast Guard cutters and increased military exchanges, education in American military schools, and the cooperation at all the levels that Ambassador Ngop and Edgar referred to. Really, it dates back a long way, and it is, if you think back at how much animus and tensions there were back in the 70s, it's really amazing to see how much hard work has been done to build the trust that leads to where we are today. Thanks.
Thank you, Murray. Let me turn the mic over to Biktron.
Thanks, Greg, for the introduction, and many thanks to the CSIS Southeast Asia Program for inviting me to this program. It's my honor to be here. To start with, as Murray has mentioned, the United States and Vietnam have come a long way, from former enemies to partners. The two countries signed a comprehensive partnership in 2013, and since then they have talked about enhancing the relationship, and there has been anticipation for the two countries to upgrade their comprehensive partnership to a strategic partnership since 2019. However, this has not happened. Some experts, including the Vietnamese ambassador to the United States, Kim Ngọc, said that the U.S.-Vietnam relationship is already strategic in nature, just not in the name. I also talked to several U.S. government officials, and they didn't see any difference between the two terms. So my question is, does it matter to formally upgrade the U.S.-Vietnam relationship to a strategic partnership? I would say yes, because it will provide the two countries with a better framework to focus and measure bilateral cooperation. Take the Australia-Vietnam partnership as an example. In 2009, the two countries signed a comprehensive partnership, which was upgraded to a comprehensive partnership in 2018. In the 2009 joint statement, the two sides promised to increase exchanges of high-level visits and engagement at official levels across all sectors. These 2 points were, much more elaborated in the 2018 joint statement. It entails frequent high-level visits between the Communist Party, the government, and National Assembly of Vietnam, and the political parties, government, and Parliament of Australia. The two sides would also strengthen political engagement through annual ministerial meetings and high-level official contacts in economics and trade, foreign affairs, and defense and securities. So from this example, I do think that a formal strategic partnership will provide a better framework for the United States and Vietnam to deepen bilateral cooperation. So the two countries, have come together at a quick pace due to common concern about China's extrajudicial claims and aggressive behaviors in the South China Sea. However, there's still lack of trust between Vietnam and the United States. There is a suspicion from Hanoi that U.S. support of pro-democracy dissidents and promotion of higher human rights standards is aiming at overthrowing the Communist Party in a process called peaceful evolution. So to build trust with Vietnam, the United States should differentiate a revisionist state from a communist regime. A revisionist state seeks to undermine the established international order for the purpose of increase its power in the system. The concept, therefore, concerns a state's behavior in international affairs. Meanwhile, a communist regime is a matter of domestic politics. China has claimed almost entire South China Sea, reclaimed and militarized disputed features, bullied other claimants, including Vietnam, and engaged in unfair predatory economic practices. These are signs of a revisionist state. The Trump administration, however, had repeatedly linked communism to China's aggressive behavior in international affairs. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo even said that communists almost always lie. And how should Vietnamese leaders feel when they heard that? It makes building trust very difficult. So, although I do think that the United States should continue to talk to China about human rights and issues with Vietnam, U.S. policymakers should distinguish a revisionist state from a communist regime. As the United States is partnering with Vietnam to deal with larger problems posed by China, I think this distinction will help the U.S.-Vietnam relationship. So moving to the U.S.-Vietnam Security and Defense Cooperation, it is the fastest growing area of the Comprehensive Partnership. In 2013 joint statement, defense and security ranked number 7 as an area of concern, focusing mostly on search and rescue, disaster response, and non-traditional security matters. In the 2017 joint statement, however, defense and security cooperation moved up to number 3 in the list. And furthermore, the two sides for the first time at the summit level stressed their intention to strengthen cooperation in the fields of security and intelligence. And we already mentioned some of the achievements in bilateral defense cooperation. So, however, since the lift of the lethal weapons ban, Vietnam has not made any purchase of American-made weapons. And another challenge is the Vietnam status under the 2017 Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanction Act that Mr. Kagan already talked about, that the final decision for the waiver for Vietnam has not been made. So if the expectation of the waiver is for Vietnam to move away from buying Russian-made weapons, then Vietnam is already tried to diversify its military suppliers. According to the CIPRI Arms Transfer Database, between 2000 and 2009, Vietnam had 38 transactions of major arms. Of those, 26 were from Russia. That accounted for 68%. However, from 2010 and 2019, among the 32 transactions, only 8 were from Russia. So that down to 25%. Other suppliers include Canada, Israel, Ukraine, and Slovakia, among others. So to conclude, I think that U.S. Vietnam defense cooperation will continue to grow, as Vietnam's most recent defense white paper state that, depending on circumstances and specific conditions, Vietnam will consider developing necessary appropriate defense and military relations with other countries, regardless of differences in political regime and levels of development. So this will pave the way for Vietnam to deepen defense cooperation with democracies like the United States, Japan, and India in the future. So I stop here and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Bic. And lastly, let me turn to Dr. Nguyen Tuan Viet. Viet, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, for the introduction. Thank you, Murray and Bic, for your very concise and very comprehensive presentation on U.S.-Vietnam relation. Murray have mapped out a long history of the U.S.-Vietnam relation to reach to the current level. And Bic has mentioned some of the key issues now in the current relationship. It's amazing that both of you emphasize a lot on the trust issue. And trust has been a very important factor in U.S.-Vietnam relation. So what I'm a professor, so what I'm telling you now is my own perspective. I'm not representing the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. But I graduated from the University of Virginia, and I did my dissertation on U.S.-Vietnam relation on the normalization process. So I very much share with Murray story of how the relationship has developed into the current partnership today. But one of the questions that I was trying to answer, that is why it took so long for US and Vietnam to normalize relation. You know that after the war, the Vietnam War ended, it took more than 20 years until 1995 for the two countries to normalize relation with each other. And even after normalization, the relationships seem to be not very normal to me, because there's very little exchange, and the development after normalization seems not to be very normal. We all know that the BTA, Bilateral Trade Agreement, negotiation, and the PNTR, Permanent Normal Trade Relation with Vietnam. Both of these have the longest and toughest process of negotiation between the two countries. So I went to interview a lot of US and Vietnam high-ranking officers. I met with Senator John McCain, Senator Jim Webb, and a lot of Vietnamese high-ranking officers as well. And the answer I got, among many other factors, trust is a big thing. That somehow it hindered the relationship from moving further. But US and Vietnam has moved a very long way, very long path to build trust to reach to this level today of comprehensive partnership. And I'm kind of more future forward looking, and I would present on how the trust has been built now, and how trust will be built in the new administrations in both Vietnam and the United States. So there's a lot of new evidence showing that a lot of trust, mutual trust, has been built between the two countries. Look at the political realm. We see that nowadays the United States respects Vietnam's political system, and there has been a lot of high-ranking level meetings in recent years, more than ever before. And our ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Hakim Mok, the other day mentioned that a recent survey conducted by an institution in Singapore showing that 84% of Vietnamese people who are interviewed answer that they trust America, they trust the United States. So among the highest in the region. Okay. So I think that's the evidence to show that trust has been built a lot in the relationship. And nowadays it seems that there's hardly any strategically important areas that Vietnam and the US cannot work together with each other. So in economic realms, I see the same thing. Despite the pandemic, in the first 3 months, the first quarter of 2021, the trade volume, bilateral trade volume, reached to $36 billion US. So that's the record in just within 3 months. And the United States has recently removed Vietnam from the list of countries of currency manipulators, just very recently. So it's not only because of the level of trust, but because of Vietnam has been taken US requests very seriously. That's what I see. And in the security realm, we also see a lot of improvement recently, that both sides has been working on the accounting for the missing soldiers from both sides, and both have mutual efforts in resolving the legacies of the wars, like the remediation of the dioxide or Asian orange in Da Nang Airport, and now in Bien Hoa Airport as well, and the appearance of unexploded ordnance like mines and bombs, which is has been done a lot recently. Well, so for the future, forward-looking, because we both have the new administration. In the United States, we have the Biden administration. In Vietnam, we recently have new leadership. So there has been the continuity and changes, as I could observe. The continuity in the US government, I believe that should still continue to be active presence and comprehensive engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And I think it's necessary for peace, stability, and cooperation and prosperity in the Pacific region. And both countries are looking forward to the maritime rule-based order. And the United States continue to appreciate the role of Vietnam in the region. And both countries share the same vision for how a region where both countries could live in for stability and cooperation. But there's also changes in the new government that I could observe. For example, in the United States, you see the Biden administration now tend to be a bit more internationalist and maybe emphasize more on multilateralism than the previous administration. So there might be more and new momentum for US-Vietnam relations to move forward into a more substantial, realistic, and deepened ties between the two countries. So what are the solutions then to improve trust between the two countries in the new leadership, new administration? I think in the realm of politics, political relationship, I think more communication between the two new administration should be promoted. I think we have done very good so far. There's a lot of phone calls, a lot of contacts between the two administrations recently, and the United States still commit to continue to respect Vietnam political system, and Vietnam's continued its foreign policy of independence, self-reliance, and no leaning to one side against the other side. So that may be the glue that may connect the two countries to build more trust with each other. In economic realm, I think there has been a good momentum already, that economic and trade relations continue to be at the center. And to my observation, it should be one of the main driving force behind the ties between the US-Vietnam relations. And especially with the new areas of cooperation like energy, if you have heard of the LNG to power project, it should be the new realm for cooperation in terms of economics and trade. And as US declare that US wants a strong and independent and prosperous Vietnam, I think more economic cooperation would facilitate that. So in terms of security and defense relations, mutual trust is even more important because we know that given the tragic past between the two countries, and given the huge difference, the asymmetric power difference between US and Vietnam, building trust is even harder, as Murray and both Vic mentioned earlier. So I think responding with the past, with the war legacies, in a more responsible manner should be the key to build more trust. And that will set the foundation for the partnership to move further. So the two countries will continue to help with the accounting for the missing soldier. To my observation, recently the United States have showed some sign to assist with the accounting for Vietnamese soldier. And Vietnam has been always very active in that as well. So that's to set aside the past, looking forward to the future. And that generates more goodwill. And from goodwill, we have more trust. And we also need to make best use of the current mechanisms, dialogues mechanisms, and maybe even more or new mechanisms for dialogues, as Murray has mentioned earlier. And I believe capacity building, maybe the relationship should move in an appropriate pace, not too fast, not too slow, appropriate pace. I think should be best, so that both sides would generate more goodwill and generate more trust. So to conclude, I think that, like the two other panelists, I'm very optimistic about the future of US-Vietnam relation. And hardly to me, we can find any area now that the two countries cannot talk to each other. Yes, for the comprehensive partnership, we have the 9 tracks, 9 channels of communication. Even with the sensitive areas like human rights, we now can frankly have conversation on that. So trust would be built more on the relationship, and I would like to end my presentation here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viet. Let's open up the Q&A. Again, if you'd like to ask questions to the panelists, please type them into the Q&A box and identify yourself and your affiliation if you wouldn't mind. I think I'll start by trying to clear a few that we had left over, though, from Edgard that I think are well suited to the panel. And we had a couple about this issue of human rights and democracy and regime differences that I'd like to get each of your thoughts on. So Zach Abusa mentioned that of course last night in the State of the Union, that some will argue wasn't a State of the Union. We heard President Biden again talk about human rights and democracy promotion being central to his foreign policy. But can the U.S. actually promote human rights as central to foreign policy without jeopardizing the improved relationship with Vietnam? And Son Tran similarly asked how the U.S. and Vietnam could resolve or settle these differences in ideology, given their growing cooperation on the security front and trying to confront China. So, Vic, maybe you want to start, given I think the interesting points you made about differentiating communist regimes from revisionist regimes.
Yeah, so I already talked about what I think that the Vietnamese would like the U.S. to do. So I would like to hear more from the U.S. perspective, and just to how to say. Anyway, so yeah, I would like to hear more from the U.S. perspective first, and then maybe I can add some more thoughts on that.
An artful pass of the buck to Murray.
And sadly, Murray doesn't actually know exactly yet what the Biden administration is going to do on democracy and human rights. They've talked about it, and they have, it's been emphasized in some relationships, like with China and the Xinjiang and Hong Kong issues. It has been obviously emphasized on Myanmar, where we had the coup and a brutal effort to crush the opposition. I think in terms of other countries and in Asia, there's been much less said. I think generally, yes, the U.S. is frustrated sometimes about how Vietnam arrests pro-democracy campaigners or arrests bloggers, but I think it is helpful that the two sides have this dialogue. It doesn't solve many problems, but as far as I can tell, but at least they hear each other out. And certainly Vietnam's human rights has improved since the early period. It's maybe as the global situation became more complicated, Vietnam has maybe cracked down a little bit harder. But so far, I don't know really what to say about what that will ultimately mean for a country like Vietnam. This is like Zach, I think, alluded to. The U.S. is going to have to balance its different priorities. Obviously, Vietnam plays a major role with regard to China. It plays a major economic role in the region. And I don't know that many people in the U.S. Yes, Vietnam is headed by a communist party, but honestly, it is. Can I just be very blunt? It's mostly communist in name. There are now millionaires that are members of the Communist Party of Vietnam. It's not exactly, the old Lao Dam Party, the old Labor Party that won the war. And I don't think Vietnam goes around trying to recruit people to join people overseas to try to become Marxist-Leninists or something. So I'm not sure that that's really a major focus for this administration anymore. Thanks.
Thank you. Viet, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Greg. To me, maybe it's too early to talk about the Biden's policy on human rights, but I think that human rights is the differences in human rights is natural, because between Vietnam and the U.S. is natural, because we have different history, we have different level of developments. So, of course, there are differences in human rights, in how we see, how we view human rights. But I do believe that human rights has been an obstacle in the relationship, and it continues to be an obstacle if the United States continue to emphasize human rights and emphasize the differences, because the differences are natural. I think all countries have different human rights, the views on human rights. But I think we can improve that, because as I mentioned earlier in the Comprehensive Partnership Declaration, this joint statement, we have 9 channels of communication, and we have a track for dialogues on human rights, and we have been, both sides have been more straightforward, more frank in addressing this issue. And I believe it will be less and maybe no longer a big hindrance between the U.S. and Vietnam relation. But it will continue if the United States still continue to emphasize those differences, even though they are natural. And regarding the ideology issue, I think it used to be important, but recently it become less and less important. And as we all know that the Trump administration, President Trump has stated that the United States or himself now recognize or respect Vietnam's political system. Okay, and there's a lot of more mutual interests that can move the two countries forward. So it becomes less important now, to my observation. Thank you.
Thank you, Viet. Vic, I want to come back to you on that one. I'd also like to ask you a related question. Well, okay, maybe not related, but another question based on your presentation, which comes up every time we talk about Vietnam now, right? The question of strategic partnership versus comprehensive partnership, which you addressed a little bit. Both Lin Dan Nguyen and Dat Duong Quoc asked whether or not and what would have to happen to upgrade the comprehensive partnership to a strategic partnership. And I wonder if part of this is mostly political, not a matter of security, and what you think their difference would actually be.
Oh yes. So from some people, including the ambassadors to the United States and some U.S. Government officials said that the content of the partnership already strategic, and some say that they don't see the difference between the two names. But through the example of the Australia-Vietnam partnership, I mentioned that actually when they upgrade the comprehensive partnership to a strategic partnership, the joint statement will draw a clearer framework. So the two countries can follow and stick with that to measure bilateral cooperations. So I think that's the difference.
Thanks. Murray, I'm going to come to you for this. We've got a couple questions, as always, about CPTPP. So Mary Tarnuska with AmCham in AmCham Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh City, and David Brown both asked about the possibility of the administration rejoining CPTPP. Mary also brought the possibility of a bilateral FTA. We talked about this a lot on our first panel on Tuesday, but I wonder what your thoughts are if there's actually a road forward here.
Well, we've all heard President Biden and his senior economic officials say that the CPTPP the U.S. could only join if the other countries were open to were willing to reopen issues such as labor, environment, you heard the other day that I forgot, one of the panelists said that, I think it was Tang, the economist, said that he doubted that Vietnam and many others would be open to renegotiating those issues. I think it would drag down the CPTPP if the U.S. is going to insist on that. I think talking to people at USTR, I think it's more likely that something could be done by having a smaller agreement, such as on digital, which is already in the old TPP, CPTPP. That chapter the U.S. was very much in agreement with, or doing an environmental goods and services agreement, which could also would also be less difficult. Now, whether Vietnam wants to go through all that after they've been so zealous in joining other agreements, like besides the CPTPP, we know they have joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, have an EU-Vietnam FTA. That's taken a lot of energy from the trade negotiators. So, I think it's going to be a little difficult to get the U.S. into the CPTPP at any time soon, partially also because Biden said that trade agreements have to focus on American workers.
Thanks. I'll send the next one to Viet. This is from Rob O'Brien at UCLA Law, who asked whether or not, what implications do you think we'll see from Vietnam's new leadership team, if any? Will there be any changes in policy?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for the question. I think this is a very interesting one. So as I mentioned earlier, we all know that we have the new leadership in both countries. But for us, the change in leadership doesn't change much of our foreign policy, because we continued a foreign policy of independence, self-reliance, and Vietnam want to be friends with all nations, to be a reliable partner and to be a responsible member of the world community. So if you may know that for the Communist Party, the leader of the Communist Party now used to be both the president and the leader of the party, but now he's remained only the general secretary of the party. And we have the new president, who is the former prime minister. And we have a new prime minister now. But the continuity in our policies from one administration to another administration is not that obvious, not so much like what you can observe in the United States, where President Biden's administration is so much different from President Trump's administration. So I would expect the continuity toward a more positive manner toward the United States, because both countries and Vietnamese governments also now continue to see the United States, continue to view the United States as a very important partner, not just to us, but also to the region, security, stability, and cooperation in the region as well. And we do not expect, to my own observation, I do not see much change in our policy to the United States. I always see optimism. I always see positive development toward the future. So that's my inner thought on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Viet. Bic, we have another question that was actually directed to Edgard, but I think it dovetails nicely with something you brought up in your presentation. Young Tae Pak with Boeing asked whether or not we should expect to see Vietnam continuing to move away from Russian defense platforms and toward the West. I guess I'd add, based on what you said in your presentation, do you think that the U.S. is going to play an increasingly large part in that, or what are the limitations, I guess, to U.S. and Western involvement in Vietnamese defense procurement?
Yes, so I think that's some of the challenges, maybe the potential reasons why Vietnam has not made, purchase of American-made weapons. I think there could be, like the incompatibility, because the majority of Vietnamese military weapons came from Russia. So to incorporate U.S. weapons into the system, it would be very challenging. And the second one is that the concern about high costs. Usually, people say that Russian-made weapons usually more affordable than the U.S. counterpart. And then another concern is the cumbersome legal procedures to acquire American-made weapons. So, if the United States, the goal is for Vietnam to buy more American-made weapons, then I think, first the two sides have to work closely together, either privately or publicly, to access what kind of weapons and equipment that Vietnam will need to replace soon, and whether, they want to add more to the inventory. And then they have to assess whether the United States has some suitable products to offer. And after, matching demand and supplies, then the United States have to find ways to address Vietnam's concern about the high price and the procedures. So whether the United States would willing to provide military, financial assistance, or the U.S. Congress is willing to make it easier for Vietnam to acquire American weapons. Yes, I think that should be the start.
Thank you. Murray, we've got a question about one of the topics I know that you follow closely in the last couple of years, which is the question of offshore oil and gas for Vietnam in the South China Sea. Paul Sarno asked, what is the progress of ExxonMobil's plans to sell its interest in the blue whale field, and whether or not any other foreign companies are going to be drilling in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone?
Yeah, I'm not quite as up to date right now as I probably should be. So I have not heard that there has been any progress on ExxonMobil selling blue whale. When the price of oil and gas were very low, there was some effort to unload it. There's also the constant battle in Vietnam of because the ExxonMobil project was to provide gas to an onshore facility close to Quang Ngai, and it would in northern central Vietnam, and that would provide generate electricity. The problem is these deals have had a long time problem getting going in Vietnam, partially because Vietnam really does not want to increase its tariffs on what it charges people for electricity. It always believes that electricity is something like a common good and everybody should get it as cheaply as possible. But it doesn't make it possible for gas companies to invest. And this was Chevron had the same problem off the Mekong Delta a number of years ago. So yeah, I don't know where that project is at the very moment, but that's one area. Those are two of the issues: the price and the price of gas and oil, and the tariffs. I don't know who is if anybody is now drilling in the EEZ. There's been exploration activities, obviously, by Repsol and by Rosneft, but I don't remember if anybody has actually started drilling. Do you remember, Greg?
The only drilling I'm aware of is Rosneft's moving forward with some of the work at Vanguard middle of last year, but the Russians are being extremely cagey, not wanting to, and I think Vietnam too, not wanting to talk about it.
And then there is, of course, the Indian ONCG, I think it's the acronym, of central Vietnam, but it's not really very energetic exploitation.
Thank you. Vic, I'd like to come back to you and maybe also ask Viet if he would weigh in on this question of India and the Quad. So we talked about this a bit with Edgard, but Adam Calderon with the U.S. Air Force asked a similar question. How does Vietnam view the Quad? And what do you think the prospects are of Vietnam becoming a Quad partner if there's some kind of Quad plus framework set up?
Yeah, so I think that, Vietnam viewed the Quad in positive terms, especially when they in the ways that they deal with China. So for Vietnam, it's beneficial, and because they support, the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and China kind of criticized China's claims there. So for that, Vietnam very welcome the Quad. But that even those the Quad members themselves, in their official statements, they say that the purpose of the group is not to counter China. But in the international communities, we often see that the Quad is trying to contain China. So even whether it's true or not, but from Vietnam perspective, because of the complex relationship between Vietnam and China, Vietnam is very reluctant to add its name publicly to a group that is viewed as countering China. But of course, there are some idea about whether there will be some group as a Quad plus. So and then you may know that Vietnam was invited to a meeting with Quad and other members like South Korea to talk about COVID measures. So and then. Vietnam, and also the group also talked about, diversify the supply chains away from China. So I think maybe in terms of securities, maybe Vietnam is reluctant to join the Quad, but if they can work on, economic matters, especially the supply chains, then I think Vietnam will be willing to join.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Yes, thank you, Rick, and thank you, Vic, for the clarification. I just want to add a few more thoughts on what Vic has mentioned earlier, because to me, as long as the Quad contribute to the stability, contribute to security and cooperation in the region, and then it will be welcomed by regional countries. And the Quad is not only about security, to my understanding, because recently, as Big mentioned, it expanded the scope of the realms of cooperation among not only the members, but also additional members, outside members. And another thing I think is very interesting is that the vaccine production now become part of the dialogue among the Quad Plus member. And to my understanding, recently the United States has agreed to sponsor India through that channel assistance, financial assistance to deal with COVID-19. And I think that may be the area that Vietnam might be interested in coordinating with the United States. It may be a new area of cooperation between the two countries, because the pandemic creates a lot of threats, but I believe it also creates opportunities for the two countries to expand the realms of cooperation. And Vietnam, I think, is pretty or maybe eager to participate on vaccine production if there is any coordination among the states. Yeah, that's my inner thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Viet. Murray, we have a question from John Sifton with Human Rights Watch. So John points out that Human Rights Watch's view is that the human rights dialogues between the U.S. and Vietnam haven't been particularly helpful, and that more useful is raising human rights in regular diplomatic talks, especially on trade and economic issues. So John wonders if the U.S. does, if USDR does come back to a trade negotiation, whether it's CPTPP or a bilateral negotiation with Vietnam, do you think Vietnam would be willing to come back to some of the agreements on labor provisions in particular that were negotiated under TPP and then dropped when it became CPTPP?
I think in the discussion on Tuesday that one of the implications was that Vietnam was probably, that's one of the things that Vietnam appreciated when the US pulled out, that it didn't have to be quite as zealous on the labor front. Yeah, I don't think that's good. I don't think Vietnam, I don't think the CPTPP is going to be a venue that the US is going to pursue with very great energy. But yes, it was pretty interesting that when the Vietnamese wanted to be in part of the TPP and with the US, that they were willing to, Vietnam was willing to make a number of concessions. And that's one of the areas that was lost thanks to the previous president pulling out. You know, the other thing is, of course, Vietnam was pretty zealous on Vietnam agreed to be pretty zealous on also on environmental issues and intellectual property rights, which that has somewhat been lost now also. Yeah, I think there would be different ways for the US and Vietnam to talk about human rights issues. I think, though, at this point, I find most Asians want to talk, they want to have a two-way dialogue about human rights. There isn't, the US really hasn't done that well itself. And so it's a little arrogant for the US to be quite sanctimonious when we see what's happening to different ethnic minorities in the US, how the police are dealing with people. And of course, you know, yes, some of these are being dealt with in the courts, but it isn't also the total respect for people with different views is not always totally respected here either. And I think it would be useful if it was a two-way dialogue ultimately, but it's a tough one. It's a tough one. I appreciate John's concerns. It's an issue, and I think I often hear from people you might call somewhat dissident in Vietnam, that they appreciate that the US raises these issues. And the fact that they can keep going and not have a shouting contest is a pretty good indication of the depth of the relationship. They even if they don't always agree.
Thanks. We're almost at time, so I want to give the last question here to Philippe Dorian, who asked whether the panelists can talk a little bit more about the Vietnam-China relationship and the impact it has in turn on the Vietnam-U.S. relationship. Maybe I could just ask each of you for your closing thoughts on that topic. Murray, since we're already with you and you literally wrote a book about it, why don't I start with you and then I'll go to Vic and close with Viet.
Well, yeah, and I don't know how to summarize, like 75 pages or something on this topic, but yes, it is a factor. It is pushes Vietnam to want to have cooperation with the U.S. as a hedging opportunity. And that's why it wants security cooperation. That's why it wants trade and investment cooperation. But it is also a limiting factor. Vietnam has to look over its shoulder and not go too far. If it goes too far on security cooperation, I think it's worried that China will somehow retaliate, and China has all kinds of quiet ways to retaliate that aren't necessarily obvious to the rest of us. So yes, China is a big factor on both the opportunities and the challenges for Vietnam.
Thanks. Vic, your thoughts?
Yes, I mostly agree with Murray. I just want to add that, because China is the next door neighbor of Vietnam, so geography plays a big role here, especially when big countries like China with, military spending about like 45 times larger than the Vietnam's. So if something happened, then, next door China could, just easily, go to Vietnam, to say invade Vietnam. Yeah, so that's a big question. And also Vietnam needs the moral support for the socialist regime, because China, Vietnam, are among the very few left in the world. Right. And also the trade issues. China is the Vietnam's biggest trading partner for many years. So all of those factors, will of course limit Vietnam's ability to further advance security and defense cooperation with the US.
Thank you, Vic. Viet?
Yes. Yeah, I think this is a very important question, and Murray and Vic has already answered many aspects of that. I just want to add a little bit on this. Both China and the United States are very important partners to Vietnam, and both are big powers. And even China is also not only a big power, but also a neighbor, our big neighbor. And we have been working with China for thousands of years, standing next to a giant, right? So it's not easy to Vietnam to stand between the two great powers, especially when they have conflicts, when they have competition. But our foreign policy with the great powers, we try to maintain a balanced relationship between both China and the United States. And that's what I would like to say. Another little things that I couldn't mention earlier, that is the opportunity for U.S.-Vietnam relation in the near future. When I talk about the change in the new U.S. administration, when President Biden's administration tend to give more priority to climate change issue, and one question was raised earlier. And I think that may be another new area, not very brand new, but another realm that the two countries can work on more, because climate change is also a great concern, a great interest to Vietnam. But and as the last one to speak among the panelists, I would like to thank you, to thank CSIS, thank Greg, and thank everyone for the opportunity today. Thank you.
Thank you, Viet, and Vic and Murray. I really appreciate you taking the time out. That's all the time we have. I'd also like to thank Edgard Kagan, Ambassador Ngoc, for speaking on Tuesday, and the panelists who joined us on Tuesday. We're going to have the video of both of these posted on YouTube soon. I imagine this one probably early next week, and hopefully the first panel today or tomorrow. And thank you again to Samsung for making this possible and to all of you for joining us. So please join me in offering the panel a virtual round of applause, and we will see you for our next event.